An elderly black man, believing his son was taking him to a nursing home, stepped out of the car only to be completely stunned by what he saw. This powerful twist will leave you speechless. Before we get into it, let us know where you're listening from in the comments, and if you appreciate narratives like this one, subscribe for more touching stories. James Carter, a 73-year-old widower, sat alone in a modest room in Baltimore, Maryland, gazing out of his window at the busy street below. Life had once been a struggle, but filled with dignity. James had always been proud, holding his head high despite the hardships his people had faced. Now, his body had weakened, his memory had blurred, and his heart had grown heavy. He lived with his son, Malcolm, and his daughter-in-law, Keisha, but he felt like a fading memory in their bustling home. James had made up his mind. He didn't want to be a burden any longer. The idea weighed on him, especially when he saw their young daughter, Zoe, growing up fast, the room she needed, now occupied by him. The hushed voices when they discussed bills and the food delivered by Miss Clara, the elderly neighbor from down the street, all of it gnawed at his sense of dignity. Perhaps a nursing home would bring a kind of relief, not just for him, but for everyone. But beneath his stoic exterior, James longed for something more, something he couldn't quite articulate. He didn't just feel forgotten, he felt unnecessary. His mind drifted back to those earlier days in Atlanta, where he and his late wife, Gloria, had built a life together. It was a modest home, but filled with love and laughter. Gloria, with her bright smile and infectious joy, had been the light in James's world. They faced the challenges of being black in the South, the systemic injustices, and the everyday battles together, leaning on each other through all the hardships. Gloria had made James a father to Malcolm, though Malcolm wasn't his by blood. From the first moment that little boy called him Daddy, James had pledged to give him the world. He worked the land, with the help of Lady, their faithful old mare, growing food, trying to live sustainably, building their small home with a strong foundation of love. Life was far from easy. The world outside was hard and unjust. James had felt the sting of discrimination more times than he could count, but his family kept him steady. Everything changed the night of the fire, the night when everything James had built seemed to crumble in the blink of an eye. It was winter, and James had lit a small fire to stay warm. The power had gone out, a frequent occurrence in their predominantly black neighborhood, an all-too-common reminder of how often their needs were overlooked. He must have dozed off from exhaustion. Working the fields had taken its toll. When he awoke, it was too late. The flames had already spread. He barely remembered being pulled out by the neighbors, the thick smoke blurring his vision, the suffocating fear. They had lost everything. Their home, their memories, the keepsakes that Gloria had cherished. They were left with nothing but each other, and even that felt broken. Malcolm took him to Baltimore to recover, but it wasn't the same. In Malcolm's house, James felt like a guest. No, not even that, more like a misplaced object. Malcolm and Keisha were kind, but they were busy working long hours raising their child. Miss Clara was the one who saw to his needs, cooking meals and keeping him company. But even she had her opinions. "They don't want you here, James," Miss Clara said, shaking her head sadly one day. "Our kids, they got too much on their plates now. And the world ain't kind of old folks like us." Her words, though meant to comfort, only deepened the ache inside of him. They rang true in his ears, each echo, reminder of the loneliness he felt. On his birthday, James sat alone with a small slice of cake Clara had left him. Malcolm and Keisha had given him hurried birthday wishes that morning, but the loneliness swallowed him whole, the silence in the house echoing louder than any birthday song. One night, James finally gathered the courage to speak to Malcolm. He stood in the hallway, his hand trembling as he knocked on the door. "Malcolm, I want you to take me to a nursing home," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't want to be a burden to you and Keisha." Malcolm looked at him for a long moment, sighing deeply. "Papa, not now," he said, almost dismissively. "We'll talk about it later. It's been a long day." James's heart sank. He felt his dignity slipping bit by bit. Days turned into weeks, his requests fading, as if they had never even been spoken. The walls around him seemed to close in, each day more stifling than the last. The weight of loneliness grew unbearable, the photograph of Gloria his only solace. He would sit at the edge of his bed each night, whispering to her, apologizing for being a burden, apologizing for still being here when she was gone. Then, on a bright Saturday morning, everything changed. Malcolm entered James's room, holding a neatly folded shirt and a pair of slacks. Keisha followed behind with fresh towels. "Get dressed, Pops," Malcolm said, his voice calm. "We're taking a little trip." James froze, a cold shiver running through him. This was it. They were finally taking him away. He nodded, wordlessly, his heart heavy, trying not to let the tears escape as he packed the few belongings he had left. The car ride began in silence. James sat in the back seat, his suitcase clutched tight, his gaze out the window. The tall buildings of Baltimore slowly gave way to open fields and stretches of highway. James watched the familiar landscape turn into something unfamiliar. The city fading, replaced by the rolling hills and patches of thick forest. The further they drove, the tighter his chest became. Was this how it would end? Taken to a place so remote, far away from anyone who knew him, where he'd slowly be forgotten? "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, fear creeping into his tone. Malcolm glanced back at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You'll see, Pops. Just trust me." The car pulled off the main road, gravel crunching beneath the tires as they approached a clearing. Malcolm turned off the engine, stepping out of the car. "We're here," he said, opening the door for James. Slowly, James climbed out, his knees trembling, his heart pounding in his chest. He braced himself, expecting the stark institutional facade of a nursing home. But when he looked up, his breath caught. There, standing in front of him, was his old house, rebuilt, beautiful, strong. The white paint shone brightly in the sunlight, the porch railings sturdy, the windows reflecting the clear blue sky. James stumbled, nearly falling to his knees. Malcolm quickly moved to steady him, his arm wrapping around his father's shoulders. "Careful, Pops," he whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home." James stood there, speechless, tears streaming down his face. He took a shaky step forward, his fingers grazing the freshly painted porch railing. It felt real, solid, a far cry from the blackened ruins he remembered. How did you—" James stammered, unable to find the words. Malcolm smiled, guiding him up the steps. "We never planned on sending you to a nursing home, Pops. Keisha and we wanted to bring back what you lost. This is your home, and it always will be." James walked through the door, the familiar scent of pine and varnish washing over him, memories flooding back. The living room was warm and inviting, the old furniture replaced but still reminiscent of the past. On the mantel above the fireplace, a single photograph stood, him and Gloria on their wedding day. James's knees grew weak, his body trembling. "We did this for you, Pops," Malcolm said quietly. "Every piece of it. It's all for you." James turned to his son, his voice cracking. "I thought I had lost everything. I thought you didn't want me." Malcolm shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. "You've never been a burden, Pops. You're our family, and family takes care of each other." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat on the porch, Malcolm and Keisha beside him. The night air was filled with the distant chirp of crickets, the gentle rustle of leaves. Lady grazed peacefully in the yard. Malcolm had found her, too, bringing her back to the land she belonged to. For the first time in years, James felt truly at peace. He had thought that his story had ended, but here, in the place he had once called home, he realized it was only beginning again. It wasn't just about bricks and wood. It was about love, family, and finding his place again in a world that had so often tried to push him aside. He looked at Malcolm, then at Keisha, his heart swelling with a gratitude he could never put into words. "I was wrong," James said softly, his voice breaking. "I thought I was nothing but a burden, but you've shown me that I am more. I am loved. I am needed." Malcolm reached over, his hand gently covering his father's. "You've always been our foundation, Pops. We love you, always." And for the first time in years, James allowed himself to believe it. Share your thoughts in the comments. How would you have handled a situation like Malcolm's? Have you or someone you know faced a similar challenge? I'd love to hear from you. Please like if you enjoyed this story, and remember to subscribe for more narratives about love, resilience, and the power of family ****.